The hour is late, and the mind, for a while, can be allowed to rest from its own devices. The body can be allowed to settle into the surface beneath it, and the breath can find its own slow rhythm. There is nothing that needs to be done, and no place that needs to be reached, only the quiet continuation of this moment into the next. If the work here offers a gentle space for rest, a simple like or a subscription is a quiet way to ensure it continues, offered only as a comfort, never as a demand. In the medieval world, the boundary between the ordinary and the extraordinary was thin, often transparent. A man might walk to the mill with a sack of grain and pass a woman collecting herbs whose knowledge was older than the parish. The same fields that fed the village in autumn could be the site of a skirmish by spring. Life was lived close to the ground, and the ground itself was unpredictable. The seasons dictated movement, and the movement of the sun dictated labor. A day began not with an alarm, but with the gradual lightening of the sky and the sound of animals stirring in the dark. The first task was often to relight the fire from embers carefully buried the night before, a small ritual of continuity in a world where so much could be lost so quickly. The smoke would rise through a hole in the thatch, and the woman of the house would begin the slow process of turning grain into bread, water into broth, scarcity into sustenance. By mid-morning, the village would be fully awake. The blacksmith's hammer would ring out from his hut at the edge of the green, a steady, percussive rhythm that marked the hour as reliably as a church bell. Children too young for serious labor would be set to watching geese or gathering fallen kindling, their games a quiet echo of the adult world they would soon inherit. A traveler passing through might stop at the communal well, drawing water and exchanging news from a neighboring valley, news of a lord's tax, a wandering preacher, a wolf seen near the wood. These were the currents of information, slow but persistent, that connected one isolated community to the next. The road was not a place for leisure but a necessary artery, and those who used it carried the dust of their journey for days afterward, a pale coat on their boots and hems that spoke of distance traveled. As the sun reached its zenith and began its slow descent, the focus of the day would shift from production to preparation. Wood needed to be stacked for the night, animals brought in from the pasture, and the evening meal set to simmer in its pot. Inside the larger houses of the manor, the rhythm was different, though no less structured. Servants moved through corridors with linens and pitchers of warmed water. A clerk might sit in a high window, laboriously copying a text by the fading light, his quill scratching across vellum in a language few in the world below could understand. In such places, time was marked not only by the sun but by the tallow candles that burned down in their holders, a more expensive and more precise measure of the hours. The lord of the manor might receive a visitor, a messenger from a distant city, and over cups of spiced wine, they would speak of alliances and harvests, their voices low and measured against the crackle of the fire. Outside the walls of such comfort, the night came differently. For the peasant in his cruck house, darkness was absolute. A single rushlight, dipped in fat, might burn for an hour or two, casting more shadow than illumination. It was a time for sleep, for the body to recover strength it would need again at dawn. But it was also a time for stories, whispered to children in the dark, tales of spirits that walked the boundary between the known world and the forest, of saints who had performed miracles at the very spot where the village now stood. The past was not a foreign country but a living presence, a layer of time just beneath the surface of the present. A plow might turn up a Roman coin, its emperor's face worn smooth, and the children would marvel at it, a token from a world that had also believed itself permanent. The coin would be kept, maybe placed on a windowsill or sewn into a pouch for luck, a small, cold link to a vanished order. In the towns, the night was a different kind of experience. Curfew bells would ring from the main church, a signal for inns to close and for honest folk to be within their walls. The streets would empty, but the night was never truly silent. The watch would make their rounds, their footsteps echoing off the close-packed buildings, their calls marking the hours. In the houses of the wealthy, the night could be a time for private devotion or quiet anxiety. A merchant lying awake might calculate the profit from a shipment of wool, his mind running through columns of figures in the dark. A mother might sit by a child with a fever, her hand on a damp forehead, listening to the labored breathing and waiting for the dawn that might bring either improvement or loss. The line between health and illness, like the line between plenty and famine, was fine and easily crossed. There were nights when the silence would be broken by more than the watchman's call. A fire could take hold in a row of timber-framed houses, the flames leaping from roof to roof faster than a man could run. The sound of the fire, a roaring, crackling hunger, would wake the entire town. Buckets would be passed hand over hand from the nearest well, a desperate chain of bodies trying to contain a force that seemed almost alive. By morning, a blackened shell might be all that remained, and the families who had lost everything would sit on the ground, wrapped in whatever had been saved, their faces blank with shock. The community would absorb them, a family taken in by cousins, a child sent to stay with a neighbor, the slow, communal process of rebuilding beginning before the ashes had fully cooled. Dawn after such a night came as a relief. The light revealed the damage but also revealed the survivors. Life resumed its course because there was no alternative. The fields still needed tending. The animals still needed feeding. The rhythms of the natural world were indifferent to human catastrophe, and so humans adapted to that indifference. A woman who had lost her kitchen would cook over an open fire in the street, sharing what little she had with those who had even less. A man whose tools had been destroyed would borrow from a neighbor, working twice as hard to repay the debt of kindness. These were the unspoken contracts of the time, the bonds of mutual necessity that held communities together when institutions were distant and slow. On a high hill, far from the smoke of the town, a monastery stood within its walls. The life within was governed by a different kind of rhythm, one measured not by the seasons alone but by the canonical hours. In the deep night, long before any cock crowed, the monks would rise for the first office, matins. They would file into the church in the darkness, their white habits ghostly in the candlelight, and begin the slow recitation of the Psalms. The sound of their voices, plain and unaccompanied, would rise into the vaulted stone ceiling, a human echo of the divine silence. For them, the night was not a time of fear but of focused attention, a turning of the mind toward things that did not change. The hours would pass in prayer and in the soft rustle of turned pages, and then they would return to their cells for a few more hours of sleep before lauds marked the approach of dawn. In the scriptorium of such a monastery, a monk might spend his entire daylight hours on a single page. The work was slow, painstaking. Each letter was formed with a deliberate pressure of the quill, the ink made from soot and gum Arabic. He might be illuminating an initial, painting a figure of a saint or a fantastical creature in the margin, using colors ground for minerals, azurite for blue, malachite for green, cinnabar for the red that marked the most important words. The world outside the window might be at war. Plague might be sweeping through the valley below. But within the scriptorium, time was suspended. The monk was not creating something new so much as preserving something old, a link in a chain that connected the present to the apostles and the apostles to the words of Christ. The book, when it was finished, would be chained to a lectern in the library, available to those who could read, a fixed point of knowledge in a world of flux. Further afield, in the deep forests that still covered much of the land, life was even more elemental. A charcoal burner might live for weeks in a clearing, his hut a simple shelter of branches and turf. His work was to tend the great mound of wood he had covered with earth and set to smolder. For days he would watch it, ensuring the fire did not break through and consume the wood too quickly, that it burned slow and even, turning the logs into the high-quality charcoal that the smiths in the towns required. The work was solitary and silent. The only sounds were the crackle of the mound, the call of a bird, the rustle of some unseen creature in the undergrowth. At night, the fire in the mound glowed like a low hillock of embers, a warm presence in the dark. The burner would sit by his own small fire, a pot of something simple heating in the coals, and the forest would close in around him, immense and indifferent. In the lowlands, the great fairs would draw people from hundreds of miles. For a few weeks, a town would swell with strangers. Tents and wooden booths would fill every available space. Merchants from Italy would display bolts of rich velvet and sweet wines from the south. Others from the Hanseatic ports would offer furs from the Russian forests, amber from the Baltic coast. The air would be thick with the smell of roasting meat, of sweat and spices and animals. Money changers would sit at their tables, weighing coins and calculating exchange rates, their fingers nimble with silver. A peasant who had walked for a week to sell a few fleeces would wander through the crowds, his mouth open at the sheer abundance of things, at the colors and sounds and smells that were so different from the muted tones of his village. He might spend a few coins on a ribbon for his daughter, a bright flash of color to take home, a small piece of the wider world to be woven into the fabric of the familiar. When the fair was over, the town would slowly empty. The merchants would pack their goods onto wagons and pack horses, forming caravans for the journey home. The temporary booths would be dismantled, the ground beneath them littered with straw and broken pottery and lost coins that children would find in the spring. The town would return to its normal rhythm, but it would be subtly changed, carrying the memory of the crowd, the echo of foreign accents. The peasant would return to his village, the ribbon carefully folded in his pouch, and his story of the fair would be told and retold for months, a small epic of the journey and the wonders he had seen. And so the cycle continued year after year, generation after generation. The names of kings and the dates of battles would be recorded in chronicles, but the lives of most people left no mark on parchment. They lived, they worked, they bore children, they died. Their stories were told only in the changing shape of the landscape, in the fields they cleared, the paths they wore into the earth, the stones they piled into walls. Their presence was in the smoke that rose from 100,000 hearths, a haze that hung over the land at dusk, a sign of human habitation as persistent as the stars beginning to show in the darkening sky. The night that settled over that land was the same night that settled over the manor and the hut, over the monastery and the forest. It was a great blanket, soft and absolute, under which the world, for a few hours, could finally be still. The embers in the hearth would fade to gray. The last candle in a high window would be pinched out, and sleep, patient and undemanding, would take the land into its care once more. In the cold hours before the true dawn, there was a period of profound stillness. The birds had not yet begun, and the wind, if it blew at all, seemed to move through a world that was not yet fully formed. It was in this time that the bakers would rise, their movements the first stirrings of the day. In towns and cities, the ovens that had been banked the night before would be coaxed back to life, the embers fed with kindling until the flames caught and the stone within began to radiate a dry, consuming heat. The baker and his apprentices would work by the light of a single lantern, their shadows vast and distorted on the flour-dusted walls. The dough had been left to prove through the night, covered in linen cloths, the yeasted mass swelling slowly in the cool air. Now it was divided, shaped, slashed with a quick blade to mark each loaf, and then slid into the mouth of the oven on a long wooden peel. The smell of baking bread would begin to seep out into the narrow street, a sense so fundamental, so tied to survival, that it could almost be called the smell of life itself. It would drift through shutters and into the dreams of those still sleeping, a promise that the day would begin, that the world would continue. Elsewhere, in the manor houses of the gentry, the servants would be moving with a quieter purpose. The great hall, where the household had slept on pallets around the central hearth, would be transformed as the light grew. The rushes on the floor, strewn with herbs to mask the smell of old grease and spilled food, would be swept and refreshed. Trestle tables would be set up for the morning meal. The lord and his family would emerge from their private chambers, their faces still creased with sleep. The chaplain would say a brief grace, and then the household would eat, the bread still warm from the oven, the ale slightly sour but nourishing. The day's business would be announced. A steward to report on the condition of the outlying farms, a messenger to be received, a dispute between two tenants to be settled. The machinery of feudal obligation would begin its slow, grinding rotation. For the lord, these were duties, the price of his position. For the tenants, the arrival of the lord's reeve at their cottage door was the intrusion of authority into their small, self-contained world. In a far-off kingdom, in a city built of stone and surrounded by walls that had stood since the time of the Romans, a different kind of mourning was unfolding. In the great cathedral, the canons were singing the office of prime. The light through the high windows was stained blue and red and gold, falling in colored slabs onto the worn stones of the floor. The voices of the men, trained and pure, wove together in harmonies that had been sung for centuries, a thread of sound connecting the present congregation to a line of worship that stretched back into the mists of the early church. Outside the cathedral doors, the city was waking to the clatter of carts and the shouts of vendors. But inside, there was only the rise and fall of the chant, the smell of incense lingering from some earlier service, the silent presence of the carved saints in their niches. It was a place set apart, an island of timeless ritual in a sea of temporal commerce. A woman with a sick child might slip in through a side door, leaving an offering at a particular altar, a small wax candle or a coin, her lips moving in a silent plea that was as old as human suffering itself. The chant would continue, indifferent to her individual grief, yet somehow containing it, giving it a form within a larger, more enduring pattern. The roads that connected these places were treacherous and slow. In the drier months, they were ribbons of deep, choking dust. In the wet, they became quagmires of mud that could suck the shoes from a man's feet or lame a horse. Travelers moved in groups when they could, the safety of numbers a comfort against the ever-present threat of bandits. A merchant caravan might stretch for a quarter of a mile, a line of pack mules and ox-drawn carts, the merchants themselves armed with swords and crossbows, their eyes constantly scanning the tree line. At night, they would form a laager, a defensive circle, and the cook fires would flicker in the darkness. The men would talk in low voices of the prices they hoped to get, of the state of the roads ahead, of rumors of war or pestilence. One of them might have a lute, and he would play soft, wordless tunes, the music carrying out into the night, a small assertion of humanity against the vast, indifferent dark. The guards on watch would strain their ears for the sound of horses that did not belong to their party, for the snap of a twig that was not made by a deer. Sleep, for them, would come in short, uneasy bursts, their hands never far from their weapons. In the isolated settlements that clung to the edges of cultivation, the approach of winter was a time of calculation and fear. The harvest was in, the grain stored in raised granaries to protect it from vermin. The livestock that could not be fed through the cold months would be slaughtered, the meat salted or smoked, the blood made into puddings, the fat rendered down for candles and soap. Every scrap was used, every resource counted. The family would huddle in their single room, the animals often sharing the space at one end, their body heat a contribution to the warmth. The wind would find every crack in the wattle and daub walls, and the fire would be fed sparingly, the wood pile measured against the length of the winter yet to come. The old stories would be told again, the ones about the winters so harsh that wolves had come into the villages, or the snow had drifted so deep that people had starved in their own homes, unable to reach the mill or the neighbor's store. These stories served as warnings, as instruction, as a way of passing the endless, dark hours. The children would listen, their eyes wide in the firelight, and the world outside the door would seem to grow larger and more menacing with each passing tale. And yet, within that same small room, there was also warmth. There was the solid presence of a father, his hand on a child's head. There was the mother, her spindle turning wool into thread with a rhythmic, hypnotic motion. There was the dog, curled at the foot of the pallet, its sleeping twitches a sign of its own small dreams. The bonds of family in that confined space were absolute. There was no privacy as it would later be understood, but there was a closeness, a physical reassurance of belonging. The sound of a parent's breathing in the dark, the familiar smell of wood smoke and wool and unwashed bodies. These were the constants of a childhood. They were the walls within the walls, the shelter within the shelter. When the wind howled and the thatch rattled, it was not a sound of terror but a sound of contrast, a reminder of the warmth within and the cold without, a distinction that was felt in the bones long before it could be articulated in words. In the great castles of the powerful, winter was a different kind of siege. The stone walls that made the fortress impregnable also made it perpetually cold. Huge tapestries were hung to block the drafts, but the chill seeped up from the flagstone floors and down from the high, vaulted ceilings. Braziers of charcoal were brought into the private chambers, their glow a poor substitute for the sun. The ladies of the court would sit with their embroidery, their fingers stiff with cold despite their fur-lined gloves. They would send for mulled wine, heated with spices and honey, and sip it slowly, trying to find a warmth that would last. The knights, when they were not training in the frozen bailey, would gather in the hall to play chess or dice, their voices loud in the echoing space. A traveling minstrel might be given a place by the fire, and he would sing long, rambling ballads of chivalry and romance, stories in which love conquered all and the heroes never grew old. The Lord would listen, but his mind would be on his stores, on the grain and salted meat that had to last until spring, on the condition of his horses, on the political maneuvering that continued despite the weather. The castle was a world unto itself, and its survival through the winter was a test of his lordship, a proof of his competence. When the first thaws came, they brought a sense of release that was almost physical. The ice on the rivers would crack with reports like gunfire. The snow, dirty and granular, would retreat from the roads. The world, which had been contracted to the space immediately around each dwelling, would begin to expand again. Travelers would appear on the roads once more, their faces pale from the long confinement. The first merchants of the new season would arrive in the towns, their pack animals thin but their goods precious. News would spread, the accumulated events of the winter months, who had died, who had been born, which lord had raised a new tax, which distant war had taken a new turn. The village would send its first plow into the field, the blade cutting through the dark, wet earth, turning it over in long, gleaming furrows. The crows would gather behind the plow, fighting over the exposed grubs and worms. The whole cycle was beginning again, the same as it ever was, the same as it ever would be, a wheel of seasons that turned with a slow and terrible indifference to the individual lives it carried along with it. In the infirmaries attached to monasteries and nunneries, the work was constant. The sick and the dying were brought there, their bodies worn by fever or accident or simple age. The monks or nuns who tended them had no cures in the modern sense, only knowledge passed down through generations of herbs that could dull pain, of poultices that could draw infection, of the simple, profound power of a cool cloth on a hot brow. They worked in silence, their movements unhurried. A man with a broken leg, poorly set by a village bonesetter, would lie on a straw pallet, his face gray with pain, waiting for the infection that would surely take him. A woman, old beyond her years, would cough into a rag, her lungs filling with the fluid that would eventually drown her. The infirmarian would move among them, his presence calm, his voice a low murmur. He knew that most of them would not leave his care alive. His duty was not to save them, for that was beyond his power, but to accompany them, to ensure that they did not die alone, that they had the chance to make their confession, to receive the last rites, to pass from this world to the next with some shred of dignity and peace. The smell of the infirmary was a compound of herbs and sweat and sickness and the beeswax of the candles that burned perpetually near the altar. It was a place of endings, but also of a strange and quiet grace. Beyond the infirmary walls, in the cloister garden, the first green shoots of the medicinal herbs would be pushing through the soil. The apothecary would tend them, his hands gentle, his knowledge precise. Here was the foxglove, which could ease a failing heart if used with extreme care, and here was the hemlock, which could end a life as easily as it could ease a pain. The line between healing and harm was as thin here as it was in the outside world. He would gather the leaves and flowers at specific times, according to the phase of the moon or the position of the planets, a practice that blended observation of nature with a belief in celestial influence that was as unquestioned as the turning of the seasons. His preparations would be stored in jars in his workshop, each one labeled in his neat, careful hand. A monk with a persistent cough would be given a syrup of honey and horehound. A nobleman, troubled by melancholic humors, might be prescribed a tincture of St. John's wort, gathered on Midsummer's Eve for its maximum potency. The apothecary's knowledge was a thread that connected the monastery garden to the ancient texts of Galen and Dioscorides, a chain of learning that had survived the fall of empires and the rise of kingdoms. In the villages, the local wise woman or cunning man served a similar function, though their knowledge was often viewed with more suspicion. They knew the herbs of the hedgerow, the fungi of the wood, the times and places to find them. A woman seeking to end an unwanted pregnancy might come to them in secret, her face hidden by a hood. A farmer whose cow was sick would ask for a charm to be spoken over the beast. These practitioners operated on the margins, their skills a mixture of practical observation and folk belief that the church at best tolerated and, at worst, condemned as witchcraft. They knew the power of suggestion, the importance of ritual. A simple tea of willow bark, which could ease a headache, would be more effective if it was brewed with the right words, at the right phase of the moon. The line between medicine and magic was not a line at all, but a blur, a gradient of belief that shifted with the perspective of the observer. To a peasant, the wise woman was a necessity, a last resort when all other hope was gone. To a zealous churchman, she was a potential threat, a channel for forces that did not come from God. Night would find the wise woman in her small cottage, a fire burning low on the hearth. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters, their shadows swaying gently in the firelight. She might be alone, or she might have a young girl with her, an apprentice learning the old ways. The girl would grind dried roots in a stone mortar, the pestle making a soft, rhythmic sound. The old woman would sit by the fire, her eyes half closed, her mind ranging over the aches and pains and fears of the village she served. She knew the secrets that were not spoken in the confessional, the jealousies, the infidelities, the desperate hopes. Her knowledge made her powerful, but it also made her vulnerable. In times of trouble, when the village needed a scapegoat, it was often the wise woman who was blamed. The line between healer and witch was as thin as the line between healing and harm, and she walked it every day of her life, Her only protection the goodwill of her neighbors and the fading memory of a world where her kind had been honored, not feared. In the great cities of the Italian peninsula, the night was a time for scholars. In the newly founded universities, students would gather in cramped rooms by candlelight, arguing over the texts of Aristotle or the commentaries of Averroes. Their voices would rise and fall, sharp with intellectual passion, debating the nature of the soul, the essence of being, the relationship between faith and reason. The smell of lamp oil and cheap wine filled the air. These were young men from all over Europe, drawn by the promise of knowledge, of a career in the church or the law. For them, the night was a time of freedom, a time when the lectures were over and their minds could roam freely through the vast landscapes of philosophy and logic. They would write their arguments on wax tablets, the stylus scratching, the words easily erased and rewritten. Their world was one of ideas, as real and as dangerous as the world of lords and peasants outside their walls. A heretical proposition, debated too openly, could lead to a charge of heresy, to the flames. And so their voices, though passionate, were often low, their debates conducted in the relative safety of the night, when the eyes of authority were less watchful. In a scholar's chamber, high above a narrow street, a man might sit alone at his desk. Before him was a manuscript he had borrowed from a monastery library, a text he had traveled hundreds of miles to see. He would copy it, line by line, his own handwriting a careful imitation of the original. His candle burned low, and he would pause to trim the wick, the flame flaring briefly brighter. The text was in Latin, the language of learning, and it contained ideas that challenged everything he had been taught. He would read a passage, then look up at the dark window, his mind wrestling with the implications. Outside, the sounds of the city were fading, the last drunkards staggering home, the night watch calling the hour. Inside, he was alone with a voice from 1,000 years ago, a voice that spoke of a world without a Christian God, a world of natural laws and human reason. It was a dangerous conversation, but it was also exhilarating. He felt himself to be on the edge of something, a frontier of knowledge that few of his contemporaries even knew existed. He dipped his quill and continued to write, the scratching of the nib the only sound in the room, the only bridge between his present and that distant, luminous past. The night would deepen, and the scholar would finally sleep, his head on his arms on the desk. His dreams would be filled with ancient philosophers and forbidden books, and in his sleep, the candle would gutter and die, leaving the room in perfect darkness. Below in the street, a stray dog would bark at nothing, and then fall silent. The city would breathe, its thousands of inhabitants sleeping in their beds, dreaming their own dreams, unaware of the intellectual fire that burned in that small, high room. The great wheel of the world turned slowly, carrying all of them, the scholars and the peasants, the lords and the merchants, toward a future they could not imagine. The stars wheeled overhead in their fixed and ancient patterns, indifferent witnesses to the small dramas of human striving and human rest that played out beneath them, night after night, century after century. The bells of the monastic houses marked the passage of time with a regularity that the secular world could never match. In the hours after matins, when the deepest part of the night had passed and a subtle shift in the darkness suggested the approach of dawn, the monks would rise again for lauds, the office of praise. The church would be lit only by a few candles, their flames steady in the still air. The psalms sung at this hour spoke of light breaking into darkness, of hope emerging from despair. The voices of the choir, roughened by sleep and the cold, would blend in the ancient chants, their sound carrying through the cloisters and into the cells where the lay brothers still slept. For the monks, this was the heart of their day, the reason for their vocation. The world outside, with its wars and famines and politics, was a distant echo, a temporary disturbance in the eternal reality of God's presence. Here, in the measured rhythm of prayer, was the only stability that truly mattered. In the refectory, after the dawn office, the monks would gather for their first meal of the day. It was a simple affair, bread and watered wine, eaten in silence while one of their number read aloud from a devotional text. The words would wash over them, sometimes penetrating, sometimes merely a background hum to their own private thoughts. The reader's voice would be flat, uninflected, a deliberate counter to the drama of the world. They would eat quickly, for the day's work awaited. Some would go to the scriptorium, others to the fields, others to the workshops where they brewed beer or tanned leather or wove cloth. The monastery was a self-contained world, a small city dedicated to God, and every task, no matter how humble, was considered a form of prayer. The brother who mended a sandal or pruned a vine was offering his labor as surely as the brother who chanted the psalms. The distinction between sacred and secular, so sharp in the world outside, was here deliberately blurred, if not erased entirely. In the infirmary, the night had passed without incident. The old monk who had been failing for weeks still breathed, his chest rising and falling in a shallow, irregular rhythm. The infirmarian sat beside him, a psalter open on his lap, his lips moving silently. He had been sitting there for hours, his body stiff with cold and stillness. The candle beside him had burned down to a stub, its flame flickering in a pool of molten wax. He did not light another. The gray light of dawn was beginning to seep through the small, high window, and it was enough. The dying monk opened his eyes, looked at the infirmarian, and then looked beyond him at the window at the light. His expression was not of fear but of curiosity, as if he were seeing something he had waited his whole life to glimpse. Then his eyes closed, and his breathing stopped. The infirmarian marked the place in his psalter, closed the book, and reached out to close the dead man's eyes. He sat for a moment longer, then rose and went to tell the abbot. The life of the monastery continued around him, indifferent to this small, expected death, yet somehow enriched by it, completed by it. Another soul had been added to the long list of those who had passed through this life and into the next from within these walls. In the world outside the monastery gates, the spring planting was underway. It was a race against time, against the weather, against the finite window of opportunity that the season provided. Every hand that could hold a tool was in the fields. The plows, heavy and cumbersome, were drawn by teams of oxen, their drivers shouting encouragement and curses in equal measure. Behind the plow came the sowers, their wide strides scattering seed from leather pouches, the grain arcing through the air in a brown cascade. Women and children followed, covering the seed with rakes or simply with their feet, trampling it into the damp earth. It was brutal, exhausting labor, bent-backed and repetitive, but it was also the foundation of everything. Without this, there would be no bread, no ale, no winter stores. The entire year's survival depended on these few frantic weeks. The sun, still weak, would warm their shoulders, and the wind would dry the sweat on their faces, and they would work until they could work no more, falling into their beds at night with muscles screaming and minds blank with fatigue. The lord of the manor would ride out to observe the planting, his horse picking its way along the headlands between the strips. He would nod to the peasants who straightened their backs to touch their forelocks, his gaze assessing the depth of the furrows, the evenness of the sowing. His steward would be at his side, a wax tablet in his hand, making notes. Which strips were lagging, which tenants were shirking. The productivity of the land was the source of his wealth, and he watched it with the attention of a miser counting his coins. A poor planting meant a poor harvest, and a poor harvest meant less rent, less food for his household, less to sell at market. It meant a winter of scraping by, of making do, of watching his own stores dwindle with anxiety. His interest was not sentimental. It was the cold, hard arithmetic of survival, dressed in the robes of lordship. He would turn his horse and ride back to his manor, leaving the peasants to their labor, the distance between them as vast as the distance between the earth and the stars. In the evenings, after the work was done, the peasants would gather in their cottages or, if the weather allowed, around a communal fire. The talk would be of the planting, of the prospects for the harvest, of the health of the livestock. A man might whittle a piece of wood, shaping it into a tool handle or a toy for his child. A woman would spin, the wheel humming softly, her fingers never still. The children would play at their feet, their games a mimicry of the adult world. Someone would begin a story, a tale from the old times, or a piece of gossip from the next village. The fire would crackle and pop, and the smoke would find its way through the hole in the roof, joining the other threads of smoke that rose from 100 other cottages. A thin, communal offering to the darkening sky. There was a comfort in this gathering, a sense of shared fate that was the only wealth they truly possessed. They knew that their lives were hard, that they could be snuffed out by a bad harvest or a passing illness. But in these moments, around the fire, they were not alone. And for them, that was enough. In a town far to the north, in a region of deep forests and long winters, a carpenter was working by the last light of day. His workshop was filled with the smell of wood shavings and linseed oil. He was building a chest, not a simple box for storage, but a bride's chest, to be painted and decorated. The wood he used was oak, seasoned for years, dense and durable. He worked with a concentration that excluded everything else, his plane smoothing the surface, his chisel carving a simple geometric pattern along the edges. The design was traditional, passed down from his grandfather, the same pattern that had adorned the chests of his own mother and grandmother. He was not an artist in the modern sense, but a craftsman, a man who knew the properties of wood as a shepherd knew his sheep or a farmer his fields. The chest would outlast him. It would hold the linens and treasures of a young woman, and then, perhaps, her daughter's treasures and her daughter's after that. In a world where so little lasted, where wood rotted and cloth frayed and bodies decayed, the chest was an assertion of permanence, a small, solid defiance of time. As the light failed, he set down his tools. He would finish the carving tomorrow. He swept the shavings into a pile to be used for kindling and closed the door of his workshop. The street outside was quiet. A few people passed, their faces hidden in the dusk. He walked the short distance to his house, a narrow building wedged between others like it. Inside, his wife had a pot of stew simmering over the fire. His children, already drowsy, looked up as he entered. He sat down on a stool, and his wife placed a bowl in his hands. The warmth of the stew, the warmth of the fire, the warmth of the bodies around him. He ate slowly, savoring each mouthful. He thought about the chest, about the way the grain of the oak had opened up under his plane, about the precise angle of the cuts he would make tomorrow. He thought about nothing at all. The day was over, and the night was for rest. He would sleep, and he would wake, and he would work again. It was the pattern of his life, and he did not question it. Simply was. In the ports along the southern coasts, the ships would come and go with the tides. They were small vessels, cogs and caravels, their hulls stained with salt and their sails patched and repatched. They carried cargoes of wine from Gascony, wool from England, salt from the Atlantic coast, spices from the Levant. The sailors who manned them were a breed apart, their skin weathered by sun and wind, their eyes always scanning the horizon. They spoke a mixture of languages, a pidgin of trade that allowed them to navigate the ports of a dozen kingdoms. Their lives were lived between land and sea, belonging fully to neither. In port, they would drink and gamble and brawl, spending in a few days the wages they had earned over months. At sea, they would endure storms and calms, hunger and thirst, the constant threat of pirates, or simply the vast, unknowable indifference of the ocean. They were the arteries of the medieval world, carrying its lifeblood from one extremity to another, and their labor was as hard, as dangerous, and as essential as that of the peasants who tilled the fields. A ship's captain, standing on the quay at dusk, would watch his vessel being unloaded. The work would continue by torchlight, the flickering flames illuminating the backs of the stevedores as they carried bales and barrels down the gangplank. The cargo was his responsibility, his investment, his risk. If the ship foundered, he lost everything. If the market had shifted while he was at sea, he could be ruined. But if all went well, if the winds held and the buyers were waiting, he would make a profit that would allow him to buy a larger share of the next voyage, to climb a little higher in the precarious hierarchy of merchant adventurers. He thought of his wife, in their house overlooking the harbor, of his children, who were growing up with only a vague memory of his face. He thought of the sea, of its endless motion, its indifference to his hopes and fears. He would sail again as soon as the ship was reloaded, as soon as the cargo was sold. He had no choice. The sea was in his blood, a calling as strong and as incomprehensible as the monk's calling to prayer. Further inland, in the heart of a great forest, a party of hunters was making camp as the light failed. They had been tracking a stag for 2 days, following its prints through the undergrowth, losing it, finding it again. They were not hunting for sport, though the Lord who led them might frame it that way. They were hunting for meat, for fresh food to supplement the salted provisions of the manor. The Lord's huntsman, a man whose knowledge of the forest was as intimate as a farmer's knowledge of his fields, directed the setting of the camp. Fires were lit, a rough shelter of branches was erected. The horses were hobbled and turned loose to graze. The men sat around the fires, passing a skin of wine, their voices low. They spoke of the stag, of its size, of the direction it was heading. They spoke of wolves, of a pack that had been seen in this part of the forest, of a shepherd who had lost 3 sheep to them. The firelight played on their faces, picking out the weathered lines, the stubble, the watchful eyes. The forest surrounded them, immense and dark, filled with sounds they could not quite identify. They were the predators now, but they knew, with a certainty that needed no words, that the line between predator and prey was thin, and that the forest was watching them as intently as they watched the stag. The hunt would resume at first light. The men would be up before dawn, eating a quick meal of cold meat and bread, checking their weapons, their breath misting in the cold air. The huntsman would examine the ground, finding the tracks again, confirming the direction. The hounds would be eager, straining at their leashes, their whines a high-pitched counterpoint to the low voices of the men. Then they would move off, a silent line of figures disappearing into the trees, swallowed by the forest as completely as if they had never been. The camp would be left behind, a circle of ash and disturbed earth, a temporary scar that the forest would soon reclaim. The hunt was a ritual as old as humanity, a dance of life and death played out in the cathedral silence of the woods, and for the men who participated, it was a reminder of something primal, something that lay beneath the veneer of Christian piety and feudal obligation. It was a connection to a past they did not remember, a past written in their blood and their bones. And the forest would hold its secrets. The stag would run, its heart pounding, its senses alive to every scent and sound. It would lead them on a chase that could last for hours, through clearings and thickets, across streams and up rocky slopes. The hounds would bay, their voices echoing through the trees, a sound of pure, single-minded pursuit. The men would follow, their horses crashing through the undergrowth, their own breath coming in gasps. It was a moment of intense, focused life, a concentration of all their energies into a single goal. And when the stag was finally brought to bay, when it turned to face its pursuers with the desperate courage of a cornered creature, there would be a moment of strange stillness, a recognition between hunter and hunted that was older than any words. Then the Lord's spear would flash, and it would be over. The body would be dressed where it fell, the meat shared out according to ancient custom, the hide and antlers taken as trophies. The life of the forest would continue around them, indifferent to this small, bloody drama. The hunt was over, and the hunters would make their way home, carrying the weight of their success, leaving behind only the bones and the memory of the chase. In the high pastures, where the trees gave way to open ground and the air grew thin and sharp, the shepherds would spend the summer months with their flocks. They lived in simple stone bothies, their roofs turfed over, their interiors dark and smoky. The sheep were their world, their wealth, their responsibility. Each dawn, they would lead them out to graze on the short, sweet grass, watching always for the shadow of an eagle, the slinking form of a wolf, the telltale limp that signified sickness or injury. The work was solitary, the days long and quiet. The only sounds were the bleating of the sheep, the cry of the wind, the distant rumble of a stone fall from the crags above. At night, they would sit by a small fire of peat or dried dung, the flames a small point of warmth in the vast, cold darkness. They would eat their simple food, their eyes on the stars, their minds ranging over the same thoughts they had thought 1,000 times before. They were the guardians of the edge, the men who lived where cultivation stopped and the wild began. One such shepherd, an old man with a face carved by wind and sun, had been coming to these pastures for more than 50 years. He knew every rock, every stream, every fold in the land where a ewe might seek shelter from a storm. He knew the names of the peaks, names that had been given by his grandfather and his grandfather's grandfather, names that were not written on any map but were carried in the memory of the people who lived here. He could read the weather in the clouds, the movement of the birds, the feel of the air on his cheek. His life was measured not in hours and minutes but in seasons, in the cycle of lambing and shearing, of driving the flock up to the high pastures in the spring and back down to the valley before the first deep snows of winter. He had no need of bells or clocks. The world itself told him the time. On this night, he sat as he always sat, his back against the stone wall of his bothy. His dog curled at his feet. The fire was small, the flames barely visible in the twilight. He was thinking of nothing in particular, his mind as empty and clear as the sky above him. Then he heard it, a sound that did not belong. It was a bell, but not the bell of a church or a chapel. It was a smaller, higher sound, and it came from the direction of the pass, the route that led up from the valley. He listened, his head tilted. The sound came again, and then again, a regular, rhythmic tinkling. It was the bell of a mule, or perhaps a pack horse. Someone was coming, traveling at night, which was unusual and, in these parts, potentially dangerous. The shepherd did not move. He waited. The sound grew louder, closer. He could hear now the scuff of hooves on stone, the heavy breathing of an animal climbing a steep grade. Then he saw them, a dark shape emerging from the deeper darkness of the pass, a man leading a mule. The man stopped when he saw the glow of the fire. He called out, a word of greeting in a language the shepherd did not understand. The shepherd did not reply. He simply watched. The man came closer, and the firelight revealed his face. He was young, younger than the shepherd had expected, with dark eyes and a beard that was little more than stubble. His clothes were travel-stained, his boots worn. He looked tired, desperately tired. He spoke again, a different language this time, and the shepherd recognized a few words. Pilgrim, perhaps, or a fugitive. It was not his concern. He gestured to the ground by the fire. The young man nodded. his gratitude visible even in the dim light. He sat, and the shepherd handed him a piece of bread and a skin of water. They did not speak. There was nothing to say. The fire crackled. The dog slept. The stars wheeled overhead. And two strangers shared a moment of warmth in the cold heart of the night. By morning, the young man was gone. The shepherd woke to find the fire dead and the place by the stones empty. The mules' tracks led back the way they had come, down toward the pass. He had not stayed to rest, had not waited for the light. He had pushed on through the remaining hours of darkness, driven by some urgency the shepherd would never know. The old man thought about him for a while, wondering where he was going, what he was fleeing, what he was seeking. Then he rose, stretched his stiff limbs, and called to his dog. The sheep were stirring, beginning to move toward the grazing grounds. The day's work awaited. The young man, whatever his story, was already fading from his mind. A brief flicker of human presence in the long, slow solitude of the shepherd's life. He would be a story to tell, perhaps, when he finally went down to the valley. A traveler in the night. But for now, there was only the flock, and the grass, and the sky, and the endless, patient rhythm of the day. In the lowlands, the great abbeys were not only places of prayer but centers of enormous economic power. They owned vast estates, managed by lay brothers and paid stewards. They bred sheep by the thousands, their wool the finest in Europe, sold to merchants in Flanders and Italy. They operated mills, forges, and tanneries. They brewed beer and baked bread, not only for their own communities but for the surrounding countryside. The abbot of such a house was a figure of immense influence, a lord in all but name, his table as fine as any noble's, his counsel sought by kings and bishops. The spiritual life of the monastery continued, of course, the round of prayer unbroken, but it was overlaid by a vast and complex secular operation that required constant attention. The cellarer, the monk responsible for the material needs of the house, was as much a businessman as a man of God. He negotiated contracts, haggled over prices, managed a workforce of hundreds. His day was filled with accounts and inventories, with disputes to be settled and shipments to be tracked. The quiet of the cloister was, for him, a distant memory, a luxury he could no longer afford. In his office, a small room off the main cloister, the cellarer sat at a heavy oak table covered with documents. The light from a single wax candle illuminated a column of figures, carefully written in his own hand. He was calculating the yield from the monastery's granges, comparing it to the previous year, estimating the surplus that could be sold. The wool clip had been good, better than expected. The prices in the Flemish markets were holding steady. It would be a profitable year if the ships could get through, if the war in France did not disrupt the trade routes, if. The cellarer's life was a web of contingencies, of factors he could not control. He sighed, rubbed his eyes, and dipped his quill in the ink. He would write to their agent in Bruges, instructing him to sell at the current price, not to wait for a better one. Certainty, in his world, was a rare and precious commodity. He would take what he could get when he could get it. The candle burned lower, the flame dancing in a draught from the ill-fitting window. He wrote on, his face a study in concentration, a man caught between the demands of heaven and the hard realities of earth. In the dormitory, the monks slept in their narrow beds, their cells open to the central corridor. The only sound was the occasional cough, the rustle of a sleeper turning on his straw mattress. One of the younger monks, a man who had taken his vows only a few years before, lay awake. He was thinking of the world outside, of the girl he had seen in the village before he entered the monastery, of the life he had left behind. He had chosen this, he reminded himself. He had chosen the silence and the prayer and the obedience. But in the darkness, the choice felt less certain. the path he had taken less clear. He heard the cellarer's door open and close, heard the soft footsteps as the older man made his way to his own cell. He thought of the cellarer's work, of the endless calculations and negotiations, and he wondered if that was what his own life would become, a slow drift from spiritual aspiration to worldly administration. He closed his eyes and tried to pray, but the words would not come. He lay in the darkness, listening to the breathing of his brothers, feeling the vast distance between their sleeping bodies and his own restless soul. Sleep, when it finally came, was troubled and shallow, filled with dreams he would not remember in the morning. Beyond the walls of the abbey, in a village that lay within its shadow, a wedding was taking place. It was a small affair. The families of the bride and groom gathered in the parish church, the priest mumbling the Latin words he had spoken 100 times before. The bride wore her best dress, a simple garment of wool, dyed a pale blue with woad. The groom, a farmer's son, wore a linen shirt and a pair of new leather boots, his one indulgence for the day. The ceremony was brief, the vows exchanged in voices so low they could barely be heard. Then they emerged into the sunlight, blinking, to the cheers of their neighbors. A barrel of ale had been broached, and a few simple tables set up in the street. There would be dancing later if the fiddler could be persuaded to play. The bride's mother was already crying, tears of joy and loss mingled on her weathered cheeks. The groom's father was handing out cups of ale, his face flushed with pride and the unaccustomed warmth of the drink. It was a moment of pure, uncomplicated happiness, a brief pause in the long, hard struggle of life. The abbey loomed over them, its great bulk a reminder of a different order of existence. But for this one day, its shadow did not fall on them. They were absorbed in their own small drama, their own small joy, and the rest of the world, for a few precious hours, could wait. As the afternoon wore on, the ale flowed freely and the dancing began. The fiddler played a lively tune, his bow scraping across the strings, and the young people formed a circle, their movements clumsy but enthusiastic. The older folks sat on benches, watching, their feet tapping, their memories stirred. The bride and groom were pushed into the center of the circle, and they danced alone, their faces flushed, their eyes only for each other. It was a moment of pure, physical joy, a celebration of life in the face of all the death and hardship that surrounded them. They would return to their small cottage, to the fields and the animals and the endless labor. But for now they were simply young and in love and married. It was enough. The sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, lengthening the shadows, cooling the air. The dancing would continue until the light failed, until the ale was gone, until exhaustion finally claimed them. And then they would sleep, the whole village sleeping the deep, dreamless sleep of those who have worked and celebrated and loved, and the night would cover them with its gentle, forgiving darkness. In a city hundreds of miles away, the night brought a different kind of gathering. In a large house near the cathedral, a group of merchants and civic officials were meeting in a private chamber. The room was paneled in dark wood, lit by multiple candles in iron stands. A fire burned in a large hearth, its warmth welcome against the chill of the evening. The men were dressed in the sober but rich clothing of their class, wool and fur and a single piece of gold jewelry each, a sign of status without ostentation. They were discussing a matter of great importance, a loan to the king. The king, perpetually short of funds for his wars, had approached the city for money. In return, he was offering certain privileges, certain trading concessions, a charter that would enhance the city's autonomy. The merchants were weighing the risks. The king was not always reliable. His promises could be broken as easily as they were made. But the potential rewards were immense. The man who was speaking, the head of the city's most powerful guild, was arguing for caution. The king's last war had gone badly. His credit was not what it once was. Others disagreed. The opportunity, they said, would not come again. The charter would secure their rights for generations. It was worth the risk. The debate continued, voices rising and falling, the arguments circling back on themselves. The candles burned lower. The fire crackled. Outside, the city slept, unaware of the decision that would shape its future. A decision being made in this small, warm room by a handful of men in fur-trimmed robes. The night deepened, and still they talked. Servants brought in more wine, more candles. The arguments became more detailed, the calculations more precise. They discussed the king's other creditors, his sources of revenue, the likelihood of his winning the war. They discussed the terms of the proposed charter, the exact wording of each clause. They were men who dealt in certainties, in contracts and accounts, and they were being asked to gamble on the unknowable. It made them uncomfortable, but the potential prize was too great to dismiss. Finally, as the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky beyond the shuttered windows, they reached a decision. They would make the loan, but with conditions. The king would have to pledge certain crown lands as security. He would have to agree to a strict repayment schedule. The charter would have to be sealed and witnessed before a single coin changed hands. It was a compromise, a balance of risk and reward. The guild master nodded, satisfied. He would draft the agreement himself in the morning. For now, they would sleep or try to. The decision was made. The city's future was, for better or worse, now tied to the fate of the king. They rose from their chairs, stiff and tired, and made their way out into the cold, gray dawn. The streets were empty, the city just beginning to stir. The weight of their decision settled on them, a burden they would carry until the king's war was won or lost, until the loan was repaid or defaulted upon. It was the price of power, the cost of playing the great game of politics and commerce. They paid it as they always had, and as they always would, and disappeared into their separate houses, into the waiting arms of their beds, into the brief oblivion of sleep. In the hours before the dawn, when the world held its breath and the darkness seemed to press against the very walls of human habitation, there were those who could not sleep. In a cottage at the edge of a village, a woman sat by the cold hearth, her children asleep on the pallet behind her. She was waiting. Her husband had gone to the town 3 days past, to sell their fleeces and buy salt for the winter. He should have returned by now. The road was not long, but it was dangerous, and the nights were growing colder. She told herself that he had stayed to get a better price, that he had met an old friend, that a dozen small delays could explain his absence. But the knot in her stomach would not loosen. She sat in the darkness, her hands still in her lap, her ears straining for the sound of a footstep, the creak of the door. The fire had gone out hours ago, and the cold was seeping into her bones, but she did not move to relight it. The waiting consumed her, filled the small space of the cottage until there was room for nothing else. She thought of the wolf prints she had seen near the edge of the wood, of the band of mercenaries who had passed through the region weeks before, of the stream that could rise suddenly with the autumn rains and sweep a man from his horse. Each thought was a small death, a possibility she could not escape. She sat, and she waited, and the night stretched on, interminable and silent. When the first gray light began to filter through the shutters, she heard it. A sound so faint she thought at first she had imagined it. The scuff of a boot on the path, the soft thud of a pack being set down. She was at the door before she knew she had moved, pulling it open, the cold air hitting her face like a slap. He stood there, her husband, his face haggard with exhaustion, his clothes stained with mud. He looked at her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then he smiled, a small, tired smile, and she felt the knot in her stomach dissolve. replaced by a rush of warmth so intense it made her dizzy. He stepped inside, and she closed the door behind him, shutting out the dawn, shutting out the world. He had been delayed, he said, by a broken wheel on his cart, by a flooded ford, by a chance encounter with a peddler who had told him of a village where salt was cheaper. The stories tumbled out, a litany of small misfortunes that had kept him from her. She did not care about the reasons. He was here. He was alive. She built up the fire and put a pot of porridge on to heat, and the children woke and clung to their father's legs, and the cottage, so cold and empty in the night, was filled again with warmth and life. The day would bring its own labors, its own worries. But for now there was only this, the return, the relief, the simple, profound fact of presence. In the great house of a wealthy merchant, in a city of canals and trading fleets, a different kind of vigil was being kept. The merchant himself, a man whose name was known in counting houses from London to Constantinople, lay in his bed, unable to sleep. He was old, older than he felt, and his body was beginning to fail him. His joints ached, his breath came short, and there was a pain in his chest that would not go away, a dull, persistent ache that he tried to ignore. He had summoned the best physicians, had paid them handsomely for their purges and their potions, but nothing helped. He knew with a certainty that he could not explain that his time was growing short. He thought of his ships, scattered across the seas, carrying his goods to distant ports. He thought of his warehouses, filled with spices and silks and wool. He thought of his gold, stacked in strong boxes in the cellar, more gold than he could ever spend. And it all seemed meaningless, a collection of things that would outlast him, that would pass into the hands of others, that would be scattered and spent and forgotten. He thought of his wife, dead these 10 years, of the children who had died in infancy, of the son who now managed his affairs and waited, with what patience he could muster, for his inheritance. He thought of the priest who had come that afternoon, offering the last rites, which he had refused. He was not ready. He would never be ready. He lay in the darkness, listening to the lap of the canal water against the stone foundations of his house, and he felt the vast, cold indifference of the universe pressing down on him. The night offered no comfort. It offered only more darkness, more silence, more time to think. In a room across the canal, his son also lay awake. But his thoughts were different. He was thinking of the business, of the opportunities that his father's conservatism had prevented him from pursuing. He was thinking of a new trade route, a new source of alum, a new partnership with a merchant in Bruges. He was thinking of the future, of the day when he would finally be free to make his own decisions, to take his own risks, to build his own fortune. He loved his father, in a distant, dutiful way, but he also resented him, resented his caution, his reluctance to let go, his stubborn insistence on remaining at the center of things long after his mind had begun to dull. The son lay in his bed, and he waited, and his waiting was of a different kind than the peasant woman's. He waited not for a return, but for a departure. He waited for an ending that would be, for him, a beginning. The thought shamed him, but he could not banish it. It returned, again and again, with the rhythm of his own breathing. He would inherit, and he would expand, and he would make the family name even greater. It was only a matter of time. And time, in the darkness, seemed to move both too fast and too slow. A river he could not control, carrying him toward a future he both desired and feared. In the countryside, the rhythm of the harvest was reaching its peak. The days were long and hot, the work relentless. Men, women, and children moved through the fields, cutting the grain with sickles, binding it into sheaves, stacking it into stooks to dry. The air was filled with the chaff, the dust, the constant sound of the blades swishing through the stalks. It was a race against the weather, against the possibility of rain that could rot the crop in the field, against the shortening days that signaled the approach of winter. The harvest was the culmination of the year's labor, the moment when the promise of the spring planting was either fulfilled or broken. If the harvest was good, there would be bread through the winter, ale to drink, seed for the next year. If it was bad, there would be hunger and the slow, grinding misery of scarcity. The stakes could not be higher, and so they worked, from dawn until the light failed, their bodies pushed to the limit of endurance, their minds focused on the single, simple task of bringing in the grain. The lord of the manor rode through the fields, his horse picking its way between the stooks. He observed the work with a practiced eye, noting which strips were yielding well, which tenants were lagging. His steward was with him, as always, his tablet covered with figures. The Lord's share of the harvest, the tithes and the rents, would fill his granaries, provide for his household, generate the surplus that could be sold for coin. He was satisfied with what he saw. The harvest would be adequate, perhaps even good. There would be enough. He turned his horse and rode back toward the manor, his mind already moving on to other matters, to the autumn hunting, to the political negotiations that would occupy the winter months. The peasants in the fields barely glanced up as he passed. He was a part of the landscape, as fixed and as distant as the hill on which his manor stood. His presence or his absence made no difference to the work. The grain still needed to be cut. The sheaves still needed to be bound. The rhythm of the harvest was its own master, and it answered to no one, not even a lord. In the evenings, after the work was done, the harvesters would gather in the fields for a communal meal. The lord, as was the custom, would provide a feast. A roasted ox, barrels of ale, loaves of fresh bread. The tension of the day would dissolve in laughter and song. The fiddler would play, and the young people would dance on the stubble, their exhaustion forgotten in the brief, intense pleasure of the moment. The older folk would sit on the ground, their backs against the stooks, watching, remembering their own youth. The firelight would flicker on their faces, picking out the deep lines, the weathered skin, the eyes that had seen so many harvests come and go. A man would tell a story, a tale from his grandfather's time, of a harvest so bountiful that the granaries could not hold it, of a winter so harsh that the wolves had come into the villages. The children would listen, their eyes wide, the story becoming a part of their own memory, a thread connecting them to a past they had not lived. The night would deepen, and the fire would burn low, and one by one, the harvesters would drift away, back to their cottages, to the brief oblivion of sleep before the work began again. The fields, so full of life and labor during the day, would be empty under the stars, the stooks standing like silent sentinels, waiting for the dawn. In a monastery far from the harvest fields, the rhythm of the divine office continued, unchanging, impervious to the seasons. The monks rose in the night for vigils, their voices rising in the darkness, the psalms a thread of sound that connected their small community to the larger body of the church, to the angels and the saints, to the very throne of God. The abbot, an old man now, his voice reduced to a whisper, led them in prayer. He had been a monk for 60 years, had seen abbots come and go, had witnessed plagues and famines and wars from within the shelter of these walls. He had watched young men enter the novitiate, full of fervor, and had watched them grow old, their fervor tempered into something quieter, more enduring. He had buried most of them. He thought of them now, in the darkness of the choir, their faces rising in his memory, each one a small, distinct presence that had shaped his own life in ways he could not fully articulate. The chant continued, the voices of the living blending with the silent chorus of the dead. The abbot closed his eyes, and for a moment, the distinction between the two seemed to blur. He was here and they were there, but the prayer was the same, the words unchanged. the need for grace as urgent as it had ever been. The night office ended, and the monks filed out of the choir, returning to their cells for a few more hours of sleep. The abbot remained, kneeling in the darkness, his body still, his mind at peace. He was ready, he thought, whenever the call came. He had lived his life, had done his work, had prayed his prayers. The rest was in hands greater than his own. He rose, slowly, his joints aching, and made his way to his cell, the stone corridor cold beneath his bare feet. He lay down on his narrow bed, and sleep, when it came, was gentle and deep. In a village on the edge of a great forest, a child was born as the night reached its deepest point. The midwife, a woman whose hands had brought dozens of children into the world, worked by the light of a single tallow candle. The mother, exhausted and pale, lay on the bed of straw, her breathing shallow. The father waited outside, pacing in the darkness, his ears straining for the sound of a cry. When it came, thin and reedy, he fell to his knees, his face in his hands, overcome with a relief so intense it was almost painful. The midwife opened the door and beckoned him inside. He looked at his wife, her face wet with sweat and tears, and then at the small, wrinkled creature in her arms. It was a boy, his son. He reached out a trembling finger and touched the baby's cheek, the skin impossibly soft, impossibly warm. The world, for a moment, narrowed to this small room, to these three people bound together by blood and love and the shared miracle of survival. The candle flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. Outside, the forest stretched away into the darkness, immense and unknowable. But inside there was only this, the beginning, the continuation, the small, fragile flame of a new life, burning in the vast, indifferent night. The father sat down on the floor beside the bed, and he did not move, did not speak, did not take his eyes from his son's face. He would sit there until the dawn, a silent guardian, a witness to the first hours of a life that would, in its turn, witness its own dawns and dusks, its own joys and sorrows, its own small, precious moments of being alive. In the days that followed the birth, the cottage was filled with a quiet, continuous bustle. Women from the village came and went, bringing small gifts of eggs or a piece of salted fish, sitting for a while by the fire to offer advice or simply to share in the warmth of the new life. The mother lay in her bed, the child at her breast, her body slowly gathering its strength. The father, who had returned to the fields, would come home at dusk and sit beside her, his work-roughened hand resting lightly on the blanket that covered them both. He would look at the child, at the tiny fingers curled around his wife's, and feel a wonder that did not diminish with repetition. This was his. This was theirs. A piece of the future, arrived in the present, demanding nothing but offering everything. The fire would crackle, the wind would rattle the shutters, and the small family would exist in a bubble of quiet contentment, a brief pause in the long, unending struggle of their lives. The midwife, whose name was Marjorie, returned on the third day to check on the mother and child. She was a woman of perhaps 60 years, though her face made it difficult to tell. The years of hard work and hard weather had etched deep lines into her skin, but her eyes were bright and her hands were steady. She had been present at more births than she could count, had seen mothers survive against all odds and infants slip away for no reason anyone could understand. She had learned, long ago, not to make predictions, not to offer false comfort, not to hope too much. She did what she could with her herbs and her knowledge, and the rest she left to God or to fate or to the simple, inexplicable workings of the body. She examined the mother, pronounced her healing well, and then turned her attention to the child. She held him in the crook of her arm, her gnarled fingers gently probing, her eyes searching for any sign of the ailments that could take a newborn in a matter of hours. He was small, but he was strong. His cry was lusty, his color good. She handed him back to his mother and nodded, satisfied. She would come again in a few days, but for now, her work here was done. She accepted a small piece of cheese and a cup of ale, then wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped out into the gray afternoon. The village was quiet, the fields empty, the harvest gathered and stored. The world was winding down, preparing for the long sleep of winter. Marjorie walked the familiar path to her own cottage, a small, solitary figure moving through the landscape she had known her entire life, carrying within her the memories of all the lives she had helped bring into the world, and all the lives she had seen depart from it. In the manor house, the lady of the manor was also with child, though her experience of it could not have been more different from the peasant woman's. She lay in a large bed, curtained with heavy wool to keep out the drafts, attended by her own maid and visited regularly by a physician from the town. Her meals were brought to her on silver dishes, her fire was kept burning day and night, and her every comfort was attended to. And yet, she was restless, unhappy, filled with anxiety she could not name. The child within her moved, a constant reminder of the responsibility she carried. She was not just bearing a child. She was bearing an heir, a continuation of her husband's line, a future lord of all the lands she could see from her window. The weight of it pressed down on her, a physical presence in her chest. She thought of her own mother, dead in childbed, and of her mother's mother, who had survived 8 births only to die of a fever. The patterns of the past were written in her blood, and she could not escape them. She lay in her curtained bed, listening to the crackle of the fire, and she waited, as all women waited, for the moment when her body would be taken from her control and given over to the ancient, dangerous process of bringing life into the world. The physician assured her that all would be well. The maid brought her possets and sweetmeats. Her husband visited twice a day, sitting beside her for a few minutes, his presence a mixture of concern and distance. But in the long hours of the night, when the castle was silent and the fire had burned to embers, she was alone with her fear, and the fear was a living thing, coiled in her belly beside the child. In the villages and the towns, as the autumn deepened, the rhythm of life shifted once more. The harvest was in, the granaries were full, and the long, slow work of preparing for winter began in earnest. Wood was stacked, peat was cut, the last of the preserving was done. The women busied themselves with spinning and weaving, turning the summer's wool into cloth for winter clothing. The men mended tools, repaired the thatch on their roofs, and gathered in the taverns in the evenings to drink ale and talk of the year that was passing. The talk was often of the future, of the winter to come, of the chances of snow and cold, of the Lord's plans for a new tax, of the rumors of war that drifted down from the north. But it was also of the past, of the harvest that had been, of the crops that had yielded well and those that had failed, of the animals that had been born and the animals that had been lost. The year was a story they told themselves, a narrative that gave shape to the shapeless passage of time. And in the telling, the year became something more than just a sequence of days and tasks. It became a part of their shared history, a chapter in the long, unwritten book of their community. In one such tavern, on a night when the wind rattled the shutters and the rain lashed against the windows, a group of men sat around a trestle table, their cups before them. They were farmers, most of them, their faces weathered, their hands rough. They spoke in low voices, the conversation ebbing and flowing like the tide. One of them, a man named Thomas, was telling a story. It was a story the others had heard before, but they listened anyway because it was a good story, and because in the warmth of the tavern, with the fire crackling and the ale warming their bellies, it was a comfort to hear it again. The story was of his grandfather, a man who had lived to be nearly 100, who had seen things that no man should see. He had fought in a war, had been taken prisoner, had escaped and walked home across a continent. He had survived plagues and famines, had buried 3 wives and most of his children, and he had always said, at the end of his long life, that the only thing that mattered was the soil. The soil, he would say, never lies. It gives back what you put into it, and no more and no less. It is the only truth there is. Thomas's voice was slow, measured, the words coming with the weight of long familiarity. The other men nodded, their eyes on the fire, their minds ranging over their own fields, their own truths. The wind howled outside, a reminder of the forces they could not control. But in here, for this moment, there was warmth and ale, and the quiet comfort of a story told among friends. In a monastery library, a monk sat alone, reading by the light of a single candle. The book before him was old, its pages yellowed, its binding cracked. It was a chronicle, a history of the world from its creation to the present day, written by a monk in another monastery centuries before. The monk who read it now was engaged in the slow, painstaking work of copying it, of preserving its words for future generations. But tonight he was not copying. He was simply reading, allowing the words to wash over him, to carry him back into a past that was both familiar and strange. He read of the rise and fall of empires, of the deeds of kings and popes, of battles and plagues and famines. He read of men who had lived and died long before his own grandparents were born, men whose names were now only marks on a page, their faces forgotten, their voices silent. And he wondered, as he often wondered, what it all meant. Was there a pattern to it, a purpose? Or was it simply one thing after another, an endless succession of events leading nowhere? The candle flickered, and he leaned closer to the page, his eyes straining in the dim light. He read on, searching for an answer he knew he would not find. The chronicle offered no conclusions, only more stories, more names, more dates. The monk closed the book and sat for a long time in the darkness, the questions turning in his mind like a mill wheel, grinding nothing but time. In a castle keep, high above the surrounding countryside, a lord sat in his private chamber, a letter spread before him on the table. The letter was from his king, and it contained orders that he did not wish to obey. He was to raise his men, to gather his supplies, to march north by the first thaw, to join the king's army in a campaign against a rebellious earl. The lord had no quarrel with the earl. In fact, he had always considered him a friend, a fellow nobleman who understood the burdens of their shared station. But the king's will was absolute, or as absolute as it could be made to be. To refuse was to risk charges of treason, to lose his lands, his title, perhaps his life. To obey was to march against a man he respected, to spill blood that need not be spilled, to fight a war that was not his own. He sat in the candlelight, the letter heavy in his hand, and he weighed the choices before him. They were not choices, really. They were necessities, each one leading to a different kind of loss. He thought of his wife, asleep in their chamber. He thought of his son, a boy of 10, who would one day inherit all of this, the lands, the title, the burdens. He thought of the men he would lead, the farmers and craftsmen who would leave their homes and families to fight a battle they did not understand. He thought of the winter that was coming, of the long months of waiting before the campaign could begin. He folded the letter and placed it in a chest. He would answer in the morning. For now, there was only the fire and the darkness, and the weight of a decision he could not escape. He sat for a long time, his face in shadow, his mind tracing the same paths over and over, finding no way out, no resolution, no peace. In the villages and the farms, the news of the coming campaign spread slowly, carried by travelers and merchants, by the Lord's own messengers. It was not a surprise exactly. There were always rumors of war, always preparations for conflicts that might or might not come. But this time it felt different. This time, the Lord's summons would come, and men would have to go. In the cottages, the women listened to the news in silence, their faces expressionless, their minds already calculating the loss. A husband, a son, a brother, gone for months, perhaps forever. The work of the farm would fall on them, on the children, on the old. The winter stores would have to be stretched further. The spring planting would have to be managed without the strongest hands. The future, always uncertain, became suddenly more precarious, more threatening. In the evenings, the talk in the cottages was quieter than usual. The men sat by the fire, their eyes on the flames, their thoughts turned inward. They did not speak of their fear, for fear was a private thing, not to be shared. They spoke, instead of the campaign, of the earl they would be fighting, of the chances of a quick resolution, of the hope that they would be home by summer. But the words were hollow, and they knew it. War was not quick, and it was not clean. War was mud and blood and the slow, grinding attrition of bodies and spirits. They had heard the stories from their fathers and grandfathers. They knew what was coming, and they waited, as they had always waited, for the summons that would change everything. The winter that followed was one of the harshest in living memory. The snow came early, before the last of the autumn work was done, and it did not relent. It fell in great, silent drifts that buried the roads and filled the hollows, transforming the familiar landscape into something strange and new. The villages were cut off, isolated islands in a sea of white. The cottages, their thatch roofs piled high with snow, seemed to shrink into themselves, huddling against the cold. Inside, the families gathered close to the fire, burning the wood they had stacked with such care, watching it disappear with anxiety they tried not to show. The animals in the byre, their breath misting in the frigid air, pressed together for warmth, their lowing a constant, mournful sound. The world outside the door was silent, muffled, dead. No birds sang, no wind blew. There was only the snow and the cold and the long, slow passage of time. In the manor house, the lady was delivered of her child in the depths of the winter. The labor was long and difficult, the physician's face growing graver with each passing hour. The maid ran back and forth with hot water and linens, her face pale with fear. The Lord paced in the adjoining chamber, his ears straining for any sound, his mind filled with images he could not banish. When the cry finally came, thin and reedy, he fell to his knees, his forehead pressed against the cold stone wall. It was a girl. The child was small but alive, and the mother, though exhausted and weak, would recover. The physician, washing his hands in a basin, pronounced himself satisfied. The Lord entered the chamber and looked at his wife, her face drained of color, her eyes closed. He looked at the child in her arms, a tiny, wrinkled creature with a tuft of dark hair. A daughter, not the heir he had hoped for, but a life, a new life, a continuation. He sat beside the bed and took his wife's hand, and for a long time he did not move. The fire crackled, the wind rattled the shutters, and the small family existed in a bubble of fragile peace, a brief respite from the cold and the dark and the waiting. In the village, Marjorie the midwife was called to another birth, this one in a cottage at the very edge of the settlement. The woman was young, a bride of less than a year, and her husband was one of those who would march north with the spring. The labor was quick, almost surprisingly so. The child, a boy, slid into the world with a minimum of fuss, his cry strong and immediate. Marjorie cleaned him and placed him in his mother's arms, and the young woman looked down at him with an expression of such pure, uncomplicated joy that Marjorie felt her own heart contract with a familiar, long-buried ache. She had seen that expression 100 times, 1,000 times, and it never failed to move her. It was the look of a mother seeing her child for the first time, a look that held within it all the hope and fear and love that a human being could contain. The young father was summoned, and he entered the cottage with a mixture of eagerness and terror, his face breaking into a grin when he saw his son. He knelt beside the bed and touched the baby's cheek, his own eyes bright with tears. Marjorie gathered her things and slipped out into the snow, leaving them to their private joy. The cold hit her like a wall, and she pulled her shawl tighter, bending her head against the wind. She walked the familiar path to her own cottage, the snow crunching beneath her feet, and she thought of all the winters she had seen, all the births she had attended, all the lives that had begun and ended within the small compass of her world. She was old and she was tired, and the cold seeped into her bones in a way it never had when she was young. But she walked on, one foot in front of the other, because that was what you did. You walked on, and you did your work, and you waited for the spring. In the castle, the Lord received word that the campaign had been postponed. The king, facing unrest in another part of his realm, had been forced to delay his northern venture. The Lord read the message twice, a strange mixture of relief and disappointment washing over him. Relief because he would not have to march against his friend, at least not yet. Disappointment because the uncertainty would continue, the waiting would stretch on, the sword would hang over them all for another season. He folded the letter and placed it in the chest with the others. He would tell his wife and she would be relieved. He would tell his steward, who would adjust the preparations. He would not tell the villagers, not yet. Let them have their winter, their illusion of peace. The spring would come soon enough, and with it the summons or the cancellation, or some other twist of fate that no one could predict. He stood at the window of his chamber, looking out at the snow-covered landscape, and he thought of the men who would die, and the men who would live, and the strange, arbitrary hand that decided which was which. The sky was gray, the light was fading, and the world, for this moment, was still. In the monastery, the winter was a time of intensified devotion. With the fields frozen and the work of the harvest long finished, the monks could devote themselves more fully to the Opus Dei, the work of God. The offices were longer, the silences deeper, the sense of the sacred more palpable. The cold seeped into the stone walls, and the monks wrapped themselves in their woolen habits, their breath misting in the unheated church. They chanted the psalms with a fervor that was sharpened by the physical discomfort, their voices rising into the vaulted darkness like a prayer made visible. The abbot, his own health failing, was carried to the choir each day on a litter, his place among his brothers a testament to a lifetime of fidelity. He no longer had the strength to sing, but his lips moved, forming the words in silence, his mind and heart united with the voices that surrounded him. He thought of the spring, of the rebirth that would come, of the flowers that would push through the snow and the birds that would return to sing in the cloister garden. He thought of his own death, which could not be far off, and he welcomed it, not as an end but as a beginning, a passage into a life that was not bounded by seasons or years, by cold or by warmth, by the slow decay of the body. He was ready. He had always been ready. He sat in the choir, his eyes closed, his lips moving, and he waited for the call that would release him from the long vigil of his life. In the village, the winter wore on. The snow did not melt. The cold did not relent. The stores of food, carefully counted and rationed, began to dwindle faster than anyone had anticipated. The men who were to march with the spring looked at their families and wondered who would feed them if they were gone. The women looked at their children and wondered how they would survive if the worst should happen. The children, too young to understand the fear that gripped their parents, played in the snow, building crude figures and sliding on the frozen ponds. Their laughter a strange, incongruous sound in the silent, white landscape. They did not know that the world was dangerous, that the future was uncertain, that the lives they lived were fragile and could be snuffed out in an instant. They knew only the snow and the cold and the joy of movement, of play, of being alive. And in their laughter, there was a kind of hope, a reminder that life continued, that spring would come, that the world, for all its cruelty, was also beautiful and worth the struggle and full of small, unexpected joys. One night, a traveler appeared at the edge of the village. He was a man of middle years, his clothes ragged, his face gaunt with hunger and exhaustion. He had been walking for days, he said, fleeing a battle that had gone wrong, a lord who had been killed, a company of men scattered to the winds. He was a soldier, or had been, and now he was nothing but a fugitive, trying to find his way home to a village that might or might not still exist. The villagers took him in, as was their custom, giving him a place by the fire and a bowl of thin stew. He ate ravenously, his eyes never leaving the flames, and then he slept, curled on the floor like a dog, his body twitching with the memory of violence. In the morning he was gone. He had slipped away before dawn, leaving no trace but the hollow in the straw where he had lain. The villagers spoke of him for a few days, wondering where he had come from, where he was going, whether he would make it home. Then they forgot him, absorbed back into the vast, anonymous mass of the displaced and the desperate, the human flotsam cast up by the wars and upheavals of their time. The winter continued, indifferent to his fate, and the village settled back into its long, slow vigil. In the castle, the lady recovered her strength. She walked now in the sheltered parts of the garden, wrapped in furs, her daughter in the arms of a nurse. The child thrived, growing plump and strong, her cries a constant, demanding presence in the quiet chambers. The Lord watched her with a mixture of wonder and bemusement. She was so small, so fragile, and yet so utterly certain of her own needs, her own existence. She demanded to be fed, to be held, to be comforted, and the world, in the person of her mother and the nurse, complied. It was, he thought, a kind of tyranny, the tyranny of the helpless, and it was absolute. He looked at his wife, who had risked her life to bring this small tyrant into the world, and he felt a surge of love so intense it almost frightened him. He had married her for political reasons, for the land and the alliances she brought. But somewhere along the way, something else had grown, something deeper and more lasting. He took her hand, and she smiled at him, and for a moment, the weight of lordship, the burden of the coming campaign, the uncertainty of the future, all fell away. There was only this, the woman, the child, the fire, the moment. It would not last, could not last. But for now it was enough. In the monastery, the old abbot died. It happened in the night, quietly, without fuss. The brother who came to wake him for vigils found him still in his bed, his face peaceful, his hands folded on his chest as if in prayer. The news spread through the community in whispers, a current of sorrow that was also, strangely, a current of joy. He had lived a good life, a holy life. He had kept the rule, had guided his brothers with wisdom and patience, had built up the monastery in times of trouble and kept it safe in times of peace. His death was not a loss but a completion, a fulfillment. The monks gathered in the church and sang the office of the dead, their voices rising and falling in the ancient chants, the words a comfort and a promise. They buried him in the chapter house, beneath a simple stone that bore only his name and the date of his death. In 100 years, no one would remember who he was, but the community would remember, in its bones, in its habits, in the rhythm of its life. He had shaped them, as his predecessor had shaped him, and his predecessor before that, a chain of influence reaching back into the darkness of the past. The chain would continue. Another abbot would be elected. The life would go on. The prayers would be said. The world would turn. And the old abbot, his work done, would sleep, undisturbed, in the cold ground beneath the chapter house, waiting for the resurrection that his faith assured him would come. The election of a new abbot was a matter of grave importance, not only for the monastery but for the surrounding countryside. The abbot was not merely a spiritual leader. He was a lord, a landlord, a judge, a figure of immense temporal power. The monks gathered in the chapter house, their faces serious, their voices low. They prayed for guidance, for wisdom, for the grace to choose the right man. The candidates were few, the qualifications stringent. The man they chose would need to be pious, yes, but also practical, able to manage the vast estates, to negotiate with kings and bishops, to defend the monastery's rights against the encroachments of powerful neighbors. He would need to be a shepherd to his flock, a father to his brothers, a steward of the community's resources. The deliberations lasted for days, the monks meeting in secret, their debates hidden from the world. In the evenings, they filed into the church for the offices, their voices perhaps a little more fervent than usual, their prayers a little more urgent. The community held its breath, waiting for the moment when the new leader would emerge, when the life of the monastery would find its new center. In the village, the winter continued its slow, relentless progress. The days were short, the nights long, the cold a constant presence that seeped through the walls and into the bones. The families huddled together, their lives reduced to the smallest possible compass. The fire, the bed, the pot of thin stew that simmered perpetually over the flames. The children grew restless, their energy pent up by the confinement, their questions a constant, wearying demand. The parents answered as best they could, their patience frayed by the endless proximity, the lack of privacy, the gnawing anxiety about the future. They told stories, the old stories, the ones that had been told for generations. They sang songs, the simple, repetitive tunes that required no thought, no attention. They sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, the only sound the crackle of the fire and the sigh of the wind. The winter was a test, a trial, a long, slow process of endurance. And they endured because that was what they did, because there was no alternative, because spring, however distant, would eventually come. One night, a wolf was heard near the village. Its howl, long and mournful, carried through the frozen air, raising the hair on the necks of those who heard it. The men reached for their tools, their axes and their pitchforks, and stood guard at the edges of the settlement, their breath misting in the moonlight. The women barred the doors and pulled the children close, their hearts pounding in their chests. The wolf did not attack. It howled again, further away this time, and then fell silent. But the fear remained, a cold knot in the stomach that did not dissolve with the dawn. The wolf was out there, somewhere, in the white wilderness, hungry and desperate. And if the winter continued, if the deer grew scarce and the rabbits hid in their burrows, the wolf would come closer, would test the boundaries, would find a way. The men spoke of organizing a hunt, of tracking the beast to its lair and killing it before it could do any harm. But the snow was deep, the cold was bitter, and the energy required for such an undertaking was more than they could spare. They would wait, and they would watch, and they would hope that the wolf would find its prey elsewhere, in some other village, in some other valley, far from their own small, fragile homes. In the castle, the lady took her daughter to the chapel for the first time. The child, wrapped in layers of wool and fur, blinked at the candlelight, at the painted figures on the walls, at the solemn face of the priest who waited for them at the altar. The lady held her close, her own heart full of a complex mixture of emotions. Hope, fear, gratitude, love. She prayed for the child's health, for her safety, for her future. She prayed for her husband, away on the king's business, his return uncertain. She prayed for herself, for the strength to endure whatever lay ahead. The priest murmured the Latin words, the ancient ritual unfolding as it had unfolded for centuries. for countless mothers and countless children. The child, oblivious to the significance of the moment, reached for a flickering candle, her small hand grasping at the flame. The lady gently pulled it back, and the child began to cry, a thin, reedy sound that echoed in the stone space. The priest smiled, a rare expression on his austere face. A healthy cry, he said, a sign of life. The lady nodded, her own eyes wet. A sign of life. Yes, that was what it was. That was what they all were, small, flickering flames in the vast, cold darkness, burning as long as they could, as long as they were given. In the monastery, the new abbot was finally chosen. He was a man in middle age, known for his piety and his prudence, a former prior who had administered the monastery's estates with skill and honesty. He accepted the burden with humility, his face pale, his voice steady. He knelt before the altar and received the blessing of his brothers, the weight of the abbatial ring heavy on his finger. That night, he sat alone in the abbot's lodging, the room that had been his predecessor's, and he looked at the papers on the desk, the accounts, the letters, the petitions. The work stretched before him, endless and demanding. He thought of the old abbot, of the wisdom he had dispensed, of the patience he had shown, of the example he had set. He did not feel worthy to follow him. But he had been chosen, and choice was a form of obedience, a submission to the will of God as expressed through the community. He would do his best. He would lean on his brothers, on their counsel and their prayers. He would trust that the grace of his office would sustain him, would guide him, would carry him through the dark places that lay ahead. He knelt by the bed and prayed, his words simple, his need profound. Then he slept, the sleep of the exhausted, the sleep of the newly burdened, the sleep of those who have accepted a weight they cannot yet fully comprehend. In the village, a child fell ill. It was the son of the young woman who had given birth in the depth of the winter, the boy whose father was one of those who would march north with the spring. The illness came on suddenly. A fever, a cough, a listlessness that drained the life from his small body. His mother sat by his pallet, her hand on his forehead, her eyes fixed on his face. She did not sleep. She did not eat. She did not move, except to dip a cloth in water and press it to his burning skin. Marjorie the midwife was summoned, and she came, her old eyes taking in the scene with a practiced gaze. She examined the child, felt his pulse, listened to his labored breathing. She shook her head, a small, almost imperceptible movement. There was little she could do. The herbs that might help were buried under the snow. The humors of his body were out of balance, and she had no way to restore them. She sat with the mother for a while, a silent presence in the small, dark cottage. Then she rose and left, her heart heavy with a grief that was not yet fully formed but was already present, a shadow waiting to become solid. The child died 3 nights later. His mother held him in her arms as the life left his body, as his breathing slowed and stopped, as the warmth drained from his small form. She did not cry. She sat, still and silent, her face a mask of something beyond grief, beyond feeling. Her husband, who had been summoned from the fields, stood in the doorway, his own face blank with shock. He had not known his son, not really. He had been away, working, preparing for a war that now seemed meaningless, absurd. He looked at the small, still body in his wife's arms, and he felt something crack inside him, something that he did not have words for. He crossed the room and knelt beside her, his hand reaching out to touch the child's cold cheek. They sat like that, the two of them, for a long time, the fire burning low, the darkness pressing in. The world outside continued, indifferent to their loss. The snow fell, the wind blew, the wolf howled in the distance. But in the cottage, there was only silence, and the small, still body, and the two hearts that would carry this moment with them for the rest of their lives. The days that followed the child's death passed in a gray, featureless blur for the young mother. She moved through the motions of her life, tending the fire, preparing the thin meals, but her presence was elsewhere, lost in a place she could not name. The other women of the village came, as they always did, bringing small offerings of food and silent company. They sat with her, their hands busy with their own mending or spinning, their presence a quiet acknowledgement of a sorrow too deep for words. They did not speak of the child, not directly. They spoke of the weather, of the spring that must eventually come, of the small, mundane details of their own lives. Their voices were a low, gentle hum, a background noise that filled the silence without demanding a response. And in that hum, the young mother found a kind of comfort, a reminder that the world continued, that life went on, that she was not alone in her loss, even if her loss was uniquely her own. Her husband, the young man who would soon march to war, found his own way of coping. He threw himself into the remaining work of the winter, mending tools, repairing the thatch, cutting wood for the fire. He worked until his body was exhausted, until his mind was blank, until there was no room for thought, only the simple, repetitive motion of his hands. At night, he lay beside his wife, their bodies close but their minds separated by a gulf that neither knew how to bridge. He thought of the child, of the brief, fleeting moments he had held him, of the way his small fingers had curled around his own. He thought of the war, of the men he would be expected to kill, of the men who would try to kill him. He thought of his wife, of the emptiness in her eyes, of the silence that now filled their cottage. He did not know what the future held, or if there was a future worth holding. He only knew that he had to keep moving, keep working, keep putting one foot in front of the other, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling, and feeling was a luxury he could not afford. In the castle, the lady watched her daughter grow, a daily miracle that never ceased to amaze her. The child was changing, evolving, becoming a small person with her own preferences, her own dislikes, her own will. She would reach for things, grasp them, examine them with an intensity that was almost alarming. She would smile at familiar faces and frown at strangers. She would cry when she was hungry or tired or simply dissatisfied with the world. She was a tiny tyrant, as all babies are, and her mother was her willing subject. The lady spent hours with her in the nursery, in the garden when the weather allowed, in the great hall where the child could watch the comings and goings of the household. She talked to her constantly, a stream of soft, meaningless words that the child absorbed like a sponge. She sang to her old lullabies that her own mother had sung, songs that carried the weight of generations. In the child, she saw a future, a continuation, a reason to hope. The world was dangerous, uncertain, full of loss, but the child was here now, alive, and that was enough. The Lord returned from the king's business as the first signs of spring began to appear. The snow was melting, the roads were turning to mud, and the days were growing longer. He was tired, his face lined with the stress of political maneuvering, his body thin from the poor food and the constant travel. But he was alive and he was home. He embraced his wife, held his daughter for the first time, and felt some of the tension drain from his shoulders. He had news, some of it good, some of it less so. The campaign to the north was still planned, but it had been delayed again, pushed back to the summer. The king was preoccupied with other matters, and the rebellious earl had sent emissaries, seeking a negotiated peace. There was hope, a small, fragile hope, that the whole affair might be resolved without bloodshed. The Lord did not fully believe it. He had seen too much of the world to put his faith in easy solutions. But he allowed himself to hope a little, and he shared that hope with his wife because it was all he had to give her. In the village, The news of the delayed campaign was received with a mixture of relief and renewed anxiety. Relief because the men would not have to leave, not yet. Anxiety because the uncertainty would continue, the sword would hang over them for another season. The young man who had lost his son heard the news and felt nothing, or felt too much to name. The delay meant more time with his wife, more time to grieve, more time to try to find a way back to each other across the gulf that now separated them. He did not know if that was a good thing or a bad thing. He only knew that the waiting would continue, that the future remained opaque, that the only certainty was the present moment, with all its pain and all its small, flickering possibilities. The spring came slowly, reluctantly, as if the winter was loath to release its grip on the land. The snow melted, revealing the brown, sodden earth beneath. The streams swelled with runoff, their waters rushing and tumbling over the rocks. The first green shoots appeared, tentative at first, then with increasing confidence. The birds returned, their songs filling the air with a music that had been absent for months. The world was waking up, shaking off the long sleep of winter, and the people who lived in it woke with it. They emerged from their cottages, blinking in the pale sunlight, and began the work of preparing for the new season. The fields needed to be plowed, the seed needed to be sown, the animals needed to be led out to pasture. The rhythm of life, slowed almost to a halt by the winter, began to quicken, to accelerate, to return to its normal, demanding pace. In the monastery, the new abbot surveyed his domain with a mixture of pride and trepidation. The winter had been hard, but the community had survived. The stores were low, but they would last until the new harvest. The buildings had held against the wind and the snow, though there was always work to be done, repairs to be made. The brothers had kept their vows, had maintained the round of prayer, had supported each other through the long, dark months. The abbot felt a surge of gratitude for them, for their fidelity, for their endurance. He walked through the cloister, the spring sunshine warming his face, and he thought of the work that lay ahead. There were decisions to be made, disputes to be settled, plans to be laid. There was the election of new officers, the assignment of new tasks, the endless, detailed work of administration. But for this moment, there was only the sun, and the silence, and the deep, abiding peace of a community that had found its center again. In the village, the young mother found herself standing at the edge of the small graveyard where her son was buried. The ground was still bare, the mound of earth fresh and raw. She had not been here since the burial, had not been able to face it. But something had drawn her here today, some need she could not articulate. She stood in the weak sunshine, looking at the small grave, and she felt nothing, or she felt everything, a confusion of emotions that she could not sort or name. She thought of the child, of his brief life, of the way he had looked at her with those unfocused, newborn eyes. She thought of the future he would never have, the man he would never become, the children he would never father. She thought of herself, of the hole in her life that would never be filled, of the love that had nowhere to go. She stood for a long time, until the sun began to sink and the air grew cold. Then she turned and walked back to the village, to her cottage, to her husband, to the life that continued, indifferent to her grief, demanding her presence, requiring her to go on. The spring planting began in earnest. The fields that had been fallow all winter were turned over, the dark earth exposed to the sun. The seed was sown, the same seed that had been saved from the previous harvest, the same varieties that had been grown for generations. The work was hard, backbreaking, but it was also hopeful, a gesture of faith in the future. The peasants bent to their labor, their bodies moving in rhythms as old as agriculture itself. The Lord rode out to observe, his horse picking its way along the headlands. The steward made his notes, calculating the potential yield, estimating the rents that would be due. The monks in the monastery prayed for a good harvest, for favorable weather, for protection from the blights and pests that could destroy a crop in a matter of days. The whole world, it seemed, was focused on this single essential task: the planting of the seed that would become the bread that would sustain them all through the next winter. In the castle, the lady watched the planting from her window, her daughter in her arms. She could see the small figures in the distance, moving slowly across the fields. She thought of the lives they led, so different from her own, so much harder, so much more precarious. She thought of the child she held, of the future that awaited her, of the world she would inherit. She hoped it would be a kinder world, a gentler world, a world with less suffering and more joy. But she knew in some deep part of her that the world did not change, not really. The seasons turned, the years passed, the generations came and went, but the fundamental patterns remained the same. The strong ruled the weak. The rich prospered while the poor struggled. Sickness and death took whom they would, when they would. And love, fragile and precious, was the only defense against the darkness, the only warmth in the cold, the only light in the long, endless night. The young man who had lost his son worked in the fields beside his neighbors, his body moving automatically, his mind elsewhere. He thought of his wife, of the distance that had grown between them, of the silence that filled their cottage. He thought of the war that still loomed, the campaign that might or might not happen, the death that might be waiting for him in some distant, unknown place. He thought of his son, of the small, still body, of the life that had been snuffed out before it had really begun. He did not know what the future held, or if he even wanted to know. He only knew that he had to keep working, keep moving, keep putting one foot in front of the other, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling, and feeling was a luxury he could not afford. The sun climbed higher in the sky, warming his back. The birds sang in the hedgerows. The earth turned beneath his feet, and he worked on as his father had worked, and his grandfather, and all the generations before him, part of a chain of labor and loss and endurance that stretched back into the darkness of time and would stretch forward, he hoped, into a future he would never see.